Book 4. Only a handful of women rejected the revels of Bacchus. One was Alcithoe, Minyas' daughter, foolhardy enough to deny that the god was Jupiter's son, and her impious sisters shared this wicked belief. Now orders had come from the priest for a solemn festival. Ladies and serving women were therefore excused from their household duties. All were to wear the fawn skin, take off their headbands, garland their hair, and carry the leaf-tipped thyrsus. The wrath of the god would be dire against any who slighted him. So the seer proclaimed. Obediently, mothers and young wives left their looms and baskets of wool with their tasks unfinished. Burning incense, they called on the god by his different titles. Bacchus, the spirit of thunder, lightning-born, the releaser, twice begotten and only child of two mothers. Mount Nisa's nursling, Thyones' unshorn son, the god of the winepress, planter of grapes which delight the heart, and the lord of the night dance. Father of revels and cries ecstatic, mystic Iacchus, and all the other numberless names which Liber is known by throughout the cities of Greece. For yours indeed is unperishing youth and eternal boyhood. You have the comeliest form of all the gods on Olympus, a face in your hornless epiphany, fair as a virgin girl's. The east is under your sway as far as the end of the world where the Ganges waters of the land of the swarthy Indians. You, dread god, have punished Pentheus for his impiety, punished Lycurgus who wielded his two-edged axe, and you cast the Lydian sailors into the sea. The car which you proudly drive is drawn by a pair of lynxes, splendidly harnessed in gaudy straps. Your train is composed of Bacchants and satyrs with old Silenus, drunk and supporting his battered legs on a stick, or uncertainly clutching the sides of a crook-backed donkey. Wherever you go on your glorious progress, the shouts of the young attend you, the screams of women, the banging of tambourines, the skirling of pipes, and the clashing of cymbals. Lord, in your gentle mercy be with us, the Theban women prayed as they duly worshipped. Only the daughters of Minyas stayed indoors and marred the feast with their untoward housecraft, drawing the wool into thread and twisting the strands with their thumbs, or moving close to the loom and keeping their servants occupied. One of the daughters, while deftly spinning, advanced a suggestion. While others are idle and fondly observing their so-called festival, we are detained by Minerva, who deserves better our attention. But why don't we also relieve the toil of our hands by telling stories of different kinds, and take it in turns to speak, while the rest of us quietly listen? The time will go by more quickly. Her sisters approved the idea and asked her to tell the first story. Then she pondered which of the many tales that she knew was the best one to choose. Perhaps the story of Babylonian Dercetus, goddess whose body was changed to a scale-covered fish, now swimming about in a lake, as the people of Palestine think. Or ought she to tell how Dercetus' daughter acquired her wings, and passed her declining years perched up in a white-painted dovecote? Or how a naiad made use of her spells and exceedingly potent herbs to turn the bodies of youths into voiceless fishes, until she was changed to a fish herself? Or should she relate the tale of the mulberry tree, which used to produce white fruit, but was stained with blood and came to burgeon with dark red berries? This was the story she chose, because it was less familiar, and thus she began, as the thread whirled round on the twisting spindle. The tale of Pyramus, known as a youth of exceptional beauty, and Thisbe, by far the loveliest maiden in all the East. They lived on adjoining estates in the lofty city of Babylon, ringed, as they tell, with its walls of brick by Queen Semiramis. Neighborhood made for acquaintance and planted the seeds of friendship, which time matured into love. They'd have been united in marriage, had not their fathers opposed it, but feelings may not be forbidden. Their hearts belonged to each other and burned with an equal passion. No one was in their confidence, nods and gestures the only means of conversing. The closer their secret, the stronger the flame. The walls that divided the two estates had a tiny hole, a cranny formed long ago at the time the partition was built. In the course of the years, this imperfection had never been noticed, but what is not sensed by love? The lovesick pair were the first to find it, and used it to channel their whispered endearments in safety. Often, when both had taken their places, Pyramus this side, Thisbe on that, and caught the sound of the other's breathing, "You spiteful wall," they would cry, "why stand in the way of poor lovers? You mustn't think we're ungrateful. We grant that we owe it to you, that our words have been able to find their way to the ears of our loved ones. If you would only allow us to lie in each other's arms, if that is too much, could you open your cranny enough for a kiss?" Exchanges like this were useless, with such an impassable barrier. Night came on, and they said goodbye, each printing a kiss, their side of the wall, with lips that never could feel a response. Dawn on the following day had extinguished the stars of night, and the sun's bright rays had melted the frost and dried the fields, when the lovers came to their usual tryst. This time, after sighing their tale of woe, they made a decision. When all was quiet that night, they would try to elude their guards and steal out of doors. Then once they'd escaped from their homes, they'd abandon the city as well. In case they got lost on their journey out in the open country, their rendezvous would be Ninus's tomb, where they'd hide in the shade of a certain tree. A tree which was tall and heavily laden with snow-white berries, a mulberry, close to a cooling fountain. The plan was agreed. Though the day passed all too slowly, at last the sun plunged into the waves and night invaded the heavens. Craftily, using the darkness, Thisbe maneuvered the doors on their hinges and crept from the house unseen. With her face well covered, she came to the tomb and sat down under the mulberry tree. Love made her brave when all of a sudden a lioness also arrived to slake her thirst in the nearby fountain, her foaming jaws besmeared with the blood of the cattle she'd newly slaughtered. The moonlight allowed Babylonian Thisbe to sight this beast some distance away and scuttle in fear to a murky cave. In her flight, the cloak she was wearing fell to the ground behind her. When the savage creature had quenched her thirst with a long, cool drink and was padding back to the woods, she chanced on the flimsy mantle without its owner and mauled it inside her gory mouth. Pyramus stole out later and came on the scene to observe the unmistakable tracks of a wild beast there in the deep dust. At once he grew deadly pale, but when he had also discovered the blood-drenched cloak, he exclaimed, "One night shall ruin two lovers. Thisbe deserved far better to live to a ripe old age. Mine is the guilty soul. Poor girl, it is I who've destroyed you, by making you find your way at night to this frightening place, without being there to meet you. I call upon all of the lions whose lairs are under this cliff to tear my body apart, not my innocent love's, and devour my flesh in their merciless jaws. Yet merely to pray for death is a coward's part." Then he picked up Thisbe's mantle and carried it into the shade of the mulberry. Bitterly weeping, he kissed the garment he knew so well, and cried to it, "Now be soaked in the blood of Pyramus too." As he spoke, he plunged the sword he was wearing into his side and at once, in his death throes, pulled it out of the seething wound. As he lay stretched out on the earth, his blood leapt up in a long jet, just as a spurt from a water pipe, bursting because of its faulty leadwork, gushes out through a tiny crack to create a hissing fountain of water and cuts the air with its impact. Splashed by the blood, the fruit on the mulberry tree was dyed to a red-black color. The roots were likewise sodden below and tinged the hanging berries above with a purplish hue. Thisbe now returned to the scene, still afraid, but reluctant to fail her lover, anxiously looking this way and that, and longing to tell him what terrible danger she'd lately avoided. The spot she could recognize, also the shape of the tree that she saw. But the fruit's strange color was puzzling. Could she have come to the wrong place? While she wondered, she noticed some blood, then quivering limbs pulsating on the ground. She stepped back, paler than boxwood, shivering like the sea when a light breeze ruffles the surface, but after a little while she realized this was her lover, and hammered resounding blows of grief on her innocent shoulders. Tearing her hair and flinging her arms around Pyramus's body, weeping over his wounds and mingling her tears with his blood, she covered his death-cold face again and again with her kisses. "Pyramus, what dread chance has taken you from me?" she wailed. "Pyramus, answer! It's Thisbe, your dearest beloved, calling your dear name. Listen, please, and raise your head from the ground." Pyramus's eyes were heavy with death, but they flickered at Thisbe's name. He looked once more at his love, then closed them forever. Recognizing her cloak and his ivory scabbard lying empty, Thisbe exclaimed, "Poor Pyramus, killed by your own hand, aided by love. I also can boast a hand with the courage to brave such a deed, and my love will lend me the strength to strike. I'll follow you down to the shades and be known as the ill-starred maiden who caused and shared in your fate. Though nothing but death, alas, could tear you away, not even death shall be able to part us. You sad, unhappy fathers of Thisbe and Pyramus, hear us. We both implore you to grant this prayer. As our hearts were truly united in love, and death has at last united our bodies, lay us to rest in a single tomb. Begrudge us not that. And you, O tree, whose branches already are casting their shadows on one poor body, and soon will be overshadowing two, preserve the marks of our death. Let your fruit forever be dark as a token of mourning, a monument marking the blood of two lovers." She spoke, then placing the tip of the sword close under her breast, she fell on the steely weapon, still warm with her Pyramus's blood. Those prayers, however, had touched the hearts of the gods and the parents. The fruit of the mulberry tree, when it ripens, is now dark red, and the ashes surviving the funeral pyres are at rest in the same urn. There the tale ended. The briefest of intervals followed. Leucothoë then took her turn to speak, while her sisters listened in silence. "Even the sun who sways the world with his brilliant star has fallen in love. My story's title is Loves of the Sun God. This god is supposed to have been the first to spy the affair between Mars and Venus. This god is the first, in fact, to spy everything. Shocked, he reported Venus's betrayal to Vulcan, her husband, and also disclosed where the son of Juno could catch the offenders. Vulcan's feelings were shattered. The piece of work he was crafting dropped from his hands. At once he designed an intricate netting by way of a trap, consisting of brazen links so fine that the eye couldn't see them. The thinnest of wool threads couldn't be finer, nor even a spider's web slung down from the height of a roof beam. He made the contrivance react to the gentlest of touches and slightest of movements, deftly arranging it all to encircle the bed. So when his wife and her paramour entered the chamber together, the husband's exquisite art and ingenious netting enabled the pair to be caught, unable to move, in the midst of their lovemaking. Instantly, Vulcan threw open the ivory doors and admitted the other gods. There were the guilty ones, lying together, entwined in their shame. The gods were amused, and one of them murmured, "If only I could be shamed like that." Then all of them burst into laughter. This story went the rounds of the sky for a long time afterwards. Venus took her revenge on the sun for informing against her. He had frustrated her secret affair, and would soon be frustrated in turn by a passion as strong. What use to Hyperion's son would his beauty, amazing complexion, and radiant beams be now? The truth was, the god who burns the whole of the world with his fires was burning himself with a strange new flame. The eye supposed to see all was fixed on Leucothoë. Looks which he owed to the world were on one pretty girl. He was rising too early and setting too late. To prolong his gazing, he made the daylight in winter last longer. Sometimes he'd fail altogether. His sickness of heart infected his rays, and the darkness drove the human race to panic. His pallor was never due to the moon interposing itself too low between him and the earth. It was love that had altered his color. None but Leucothoe drew him. Clymene, Rhodos, and Perse, Aeaean Circe's beautiful mother, were all forgotten, and Clytie too. Although he had scorned her, she still was eager to lie in his arms, and this new turn of events had wounded her deeply. Leucothoe made him forget many earlier passions. She came from the land of incense. The mother who bore her was called Eurynome, fairest of all, but after Leucothoe came to her prime, the daughter's beauty exceeded the mother's no less than the mother outshone the rest. Her father was Orchamus, ruler of Persia's cities and seventh in line from ancient Belus. Under the skies of the west are the fields where the sun's steeds rest and graze, not on grass but ambrosia. That is the food which sustains their exhausted limbs and revives their strength for the next day's journey. So while his horses were munching on this celestial fodder, and night was on duty, the sun god entered his loved one's chamber, taking the form of her mother, Eurynome. There, by the lamplight, he saw Leucothoe busy among her dozen handmaids, chastely spinning the fine, smooth wool on a twirling spindle. So, kissing the girl as a mother might kiss her beloved daughter, he said, "My business is confidential. Women, please leave us alone. A mother must have the right to a private discussion." The servants obeyed, and soon the chamber was empty of witnesses. "I am the one," he announced, "who measures the course of the long years, who sees all things that exist and empowers the earth to see them, the eye of the universe. Trust me, I love you." Leucothoe trembled, her fingers went limp, her distaff and spindle fell to the ground, but even in fear she was lovely. The sun god waited no longer, but quickly returned to his natural likeness and radiant splendor. Shocked as she was by this sudden appearance, the girl was utterly dazzled. Protest was vain, and the sun was allowed to possess her. Clytie's jealousy was now awakened. The passion the sun had felt for her once had not been half-hearted. Stung by anger against her rival, she spread the scandal abroad and informed Leucothoe's father. His action was savage and showed no mercy. Unmoved by her prayers, when she stretched her arms to the sun's rays, pleading, "He took me against my will," he brutally buried his daughter deep in the earth and piled a hillock of sand on her grave. Hyperion's son then cut through the mound with his rays and opened a gap which could have allowed her smothered face to emerge. But the girl was unable to raise her head. She was totally crushed by the weight of the earth and merely a lifeless, prostrate body. Nothing, they say, had distressed the winged steed's charioteer so bitterly since the fire which destroyed his own son Phaeton. The sun god tried to deploy the power of his rays to restore his love's cold limbs, if only he could, to the warmth of life. But all his attempts were opposed by fate. He therefore decided to sprinkle the body and ground nearby with perfumed nectar. Then, after a long lament, he cried, "You still shall return to the air above." At once the corpse, now permeated with heavenly nectar, melted and soaked the earth with its fragrance. Then gradually, through the soil, disrupting the mound with its tip, there emerged the sprig of a fully rooted frankincense shrub. Clytie's love could well have excused her angry resentment, and so her turning informer. Despite it, the Lord of the Daylight abandoned his visits and brought his affair with her to a close. Thenceforth she wasted away, for passion had turned to madness. Rejecting her fellow nymphs and passing her days and nights in the open air, she sat on the hard, bare soil, bareheaded, with hair disheveled. For 9 whole days she refused all food and drink. Pure dew and her tears were enough in their starving condition. She never stirred from the spot. She only gazed on the face of the god in the sky and followed his course with her turning head. They say that her limbs caught fast in the ground, and a bloodless pallor changed her complexion in part to leaves of a yellowish green, but the red in her cheeks remained, and a flower like a violet covered her face. the heliotrope, which is firmly rooted but turns on its stem to its lover the sun, still keeping faith in its new form. Leucothoë finished. Her wonderful tale had entranced her audience. Some said it couldn't have happened, but others declared real gods can do anything. Bacchus, however, was not included among them. Alcithoe's turn came next when her sisters again were silent. Running her shuttle through the threads of her standing loom, she started. No more of the loves. They are too well known. Of the shepherd of Ida, Daphnis, turned to rock by a nymph's proud anger against her rival. Lovers can be so wickedly jealous. Nor shall I tell how once, in breach of the laws of nature, Scython's gender could alternate between male and female. How about Salmacis, who once looked after the baby Jupiter, now transformed into steel, the Curetes born of the rain shower, or Crocus and Smilax, his beloved one, changed into tiny flowers? No, I shall charm your ears with a tale that's completely new. I'm going to tell you about the notorious fountain of Salmacis, how it is so, and why it softens and weakens the men who bathe in its strength-sapping stream. Its effects are renowned, though the reason's a mystery. Mercury once had a son by the goddess Venus, nurtured and reared by the naiads who dwell in the caves on Mount Ida. Father and mother could both be seen in his handsome features. Between them they also gave him his name, Hermaphroditus. Once he had reached the age of 15, he abandoned his native mountains. Ida, his foster mother, was left behind as he ventured forth to explore the unknown. The sight of new places, new rivers enthralled him, excitement taking the pain out of travel. He came as far as the cities of Lycia and Lycia's neighbors in Caria. Here he discovered a pool which was perfectly clear, right through to the bottom, entirely empty of marshy reeds, unfertile sedge-grass, and spiky rushes. The crystalline water was lushly fringed by a circle of fresh and evergreen grass. Now this was the home of a nymph, but one who didn't enjoy the normal pursuits of archery, hunting, and running races, the only naiad not to belong to the train of Diana. Often, the story goes, her anxious sisters would say to her, "Salmacis, why don't you take your javelin or painted quiver and vary this indolent life of yours with some hard, rough hunting?" But Salmacis wouldn't take hold of her javelin or painted quiver and vary that indolent life of hers with some hard, rough hunting. Instead, you would find her washing her beautiful limbs in her favorite fountain, or lazily drawing her boxwood comb through her tresses, using the pool as a mirror to find the most fetching hairstyle. Or else she'd put on an alluring dress which was fully transparent, and softly recline on a cushion of leaves of luxurious grass. Sometimes she'd gather flowers, and she chanced to be gathering flowers when she saw this glorious boy, and wanted at once to possess him. Keen as she was to approach him, he didn't move closer until she had made herself pretty. She cast a careful eye on her dress and arranged her expression. Nobody now could have questioned her beauty. At last she spoke. "Magnificent boy, one could easily take you to be a god. If you are a god, you must surely be Cupid. If only a mortal, why then, your parents are wonderfully blessed. How lucky your brother is, and so for sure are your sisters, and also the woman who nursed you and gave you her breasts to suck. But far and away the most happy of all, if you are betrothed, is the maid whom torches escort to your house in the wedding procession. If she is already chosen, allow me a stolen pleasure. If not, let me be your bride, and take me at once to your bed." So much from the nymph. The cheeks of the lad were covered in blushes. He didn't know what love was, but even his blushes became him. His skin was the color of apples on trees in a sun-drenched orchard, or ivory steeped in dye, or the moon in eclipse when its whiteness has turned to red, and cymbals are clashed in vain to restore it. The naiad continually begged him to kiss her, at least like a sister, and started to put her hands on his ivory-colored neck, when he shouted, "Stop, or I'll run away and abandon you here." Salmacis quivered with fear. "The place is entirely yours, young stranger." she said, as she turned on her heels and pretended to leave. But even then she kept looking back and secreted herself in the bushes nearby, crouched down to the knee. Hermaphroditus, thinking he had the grass to himself and that no one was watching, walked up and down by the pool, then dipped his toes in the lapping play of the stream and immersed his feet as far as the ankles. The water was lovely, deliciously cool. Without further ado, he removed his tunic so soft and so smooth from his body so slender. Salmacis now was wildly excited. The sight of him naked fired her desire to new heights. Her eyes were also on fire, like the dazzling light of the sun's reflected rays when a mirror is raised to capture its shining disk at its brightest and clearest. Any delay or postponement of joy was almost impossible. Out of control in her frenzy, she had to embrace him now. The young man, cupping his palms and slapping his torso, swiftly jumped down into the pool. As his arms flashed out in alternate strokes, his body gleamed in the glassy water, like ivory statues or pure white lilies encased in transparent crystal. "Victory! He's mine!" the naiad shouted. Then, stripping off all her clothes and tossing them wide, she dived in after her quarry, grabbed hold of his limbs as he struggled against her, greedily kissing him, sliding her hands underneath him to fondle his unresponsive nipples, and wrapping herself around each of his sides in turn. For all his valiant attempts to slip from her grasp, she finally held him tight in her coils, like a huge snake carried aloft in an eagle's talons, forming knots round the head and the feet of the royal bird and entangling the flapping wings in its tail. Or like the ivy which weaves its way round the length of a tree trunk, or else an octopus shooting all its tentacles out to pounce on its prey and maintain its grip in the depths of the sea. The boy held out like a hero, refusing the nymph the delights that she craved for. Salmacis squeezed still harder, then pinning the whole of her body against him, she clung there and cried, "You may fight as you will, you wretch, but you shan't escape me. Gods, I pray you, decree that the day never comes when the two of us here shall be riven asunder." Her prayer found gods to fulfill it. The bodies of boy and girl were merged and melded in one. The two of them showed but a single face. You know when a twig is grafted onto a tree, the stalk and branch will join as they grow and mature together. So when those bodies united at last in that clinging embrace, they were two no more but of double aspect, which couldn't be fairly described as male or as female. They seemed to be neither and both. And so, when he saw that the pool which his manhood had entered had left him only half a man, and this was the place where his limbs had softened, Hermaphroditus stretched out his hands and appealed, no more with a masculine voice. "Dear father and mother, I pray you, grant this boon to the son who bears the names of you both. Whoever enters this pool as a man, let him weaken as soon as he touches the water, and always emerge with his manhood diminished." Venus and Mercury were both moved and fulfilled the prayer of their androgen son by infecting the pool with a neutering tincture. Alcithoe's story was ended, and still the daughters of Minyas kept at their weaving in scorn of Bacchus, profaning his feast day. Suddenly, out of nowhere, their ears were harshly assaulted by clattering drums, the fearful skirling of Phrygian pipes, and the strident clashing of cymbals. The perfume of myrrh and of saffron pervaded the air. Then, hard to believe, the looms began to grow green, and the weaving to change into leafy curtains of ivy. Part of it turned into vines, with the threads transformed into tendrils. Fronds shot out of the warp, and the purple dye in the tapestry lent its brilliant hue to clusters of deep-colored grapes. By now the day had completed its course, and the time was approaching which couldn't be firmly established as either darkness or light, but a kind of disputed no-man's land between night and day, when the building suddenly seemed to be shaken, and flames to leap from the oil-rich lamps. The room was aglow with flickers of fiery red and filled with howling specters of savage beasts. The sisters already were hiding in different corners around the smoky house to escape from the flames and the flickering lights. And while they were searching for darkness, their limbs shriveled up and a membrane stretched across them to trap their arms in gossamer bat wings. How they had come to lose their former appearance they could not tell for the gloom. They lacked any feathers to lift them upwards, but simply hovered in air, sustained by their filmy, transparent wings. When they tried to speak, their minuscule bodies would only allow them to sigh for their lot in the thinnest and shrillest of squeaks. Their haunts are covered spaces, not trees, as they loathe the daylight. They fly in the night and take their Latin name from the evening. From that time onward, the godhead of Bacchus was fully acknowledged throughout all Thebes, and the newcomer's strength was widely proclaimed by Ino, his mother's sister. Alone of the daughters of Cadmus, she knew nothing of grief, except what she felt for her sisters. Her children, her marriage to Athamas, filled her heart with exalted pride, and so did the god she had nursed in his cradle. When Juno saw her, she said to herself in resentment, "The son of that harlot Semele metamorphosed the Lydian sailors and plunged them into the sea. He handed Agave her own son's flesh to be torn to pieces, and gave 3 daughters of Minyas bat's wings. All I can do is to weep for sores that are never avenged. Is weeping enough? Must that be the limit to Juno's sovereignty? No, I can learn from my foe and follow Bacchus's example. The slaughter of Pentheus is more than enough to demonstrate amply the mischief that madness can work. Then why shouldn't Ino also be goaded to madness and follow the way of her guilty sisters?" Picture a path which is overcast by funereal yew trees, sloping down to the realms below through a deathly silence. Along this path, as the mist curls up from the motionless sticks, the incoming shades are descending, the ghosts of the recently buried. A rugged region, pervaded by pallor and cold, where the alien spirits can find no sign to the road which leads to the Stygian city, and so to the dreadful palace of gloomy Dis. The city has room for all, with its 100 approaches and gates that are everywhere open. As all the rivers on earth flow into the sea, so Hades admits every soul that arrives. It is never too small for its new population, and never begins to feel crowded. Bloodless, bodiless, boneless, the spirits endlessly wander, perhaps frequenting the Forum or thronging King Pluto's palace. They could be plying some trade they pursued in their former existence, or else they are serving the punishment meted out to each one. Yielding so far to her spiteful anger, Saturnian Juno brought herself to abandon her heavenly throne and descend to Hades. As soon as she'd passed inside and the threshold had groaned beneath the weight of her sacred presence, Cerberus lifted his 3 heads, barking with all 3 mouths at once. The goddess then called on the awesome, implacable power of the sister Furies, daughters of night, who were sitting in front of the prison of hell, with its great iron gates, and combing the black snakes out of their hair. As soon as they recognized Juno approaching through the shadowy gloom, they rose to their feet. She had come to the house of the damned. Here was the giant Tityos, sprawling across 9 acres, guts exposed to the vultures. There was Tantalus, failing to drink any water or seize the elusive fruit tree above him. Sisyphus, pushing or chasing the rock which keeps rolling downwards. Ixion, pursuing and running away from himself on his wheel, and Danaus's daughters, who dared to murder their cousin husbands, always refilling their jars with water but only to lose it. Grimly inspecting these tortured criminals, Juno specially gazed at Ixion, and turning from him to contemplate Sisyphus, asked herself, "Why, of the sons of Aeolus, why should this one suffer perpetual torment when Athamas, Sisyphus's brother, proudly lives in a royal palace and joins his wife in displaying contempt for me?" She then explained to the Furies the grounds of her hatred, and why she had come, and what she wanted, which was that Cadmus's kingdom should fall, and Athamas also be driven by madness to crime. As she pestered her audience to help her, commands were mingled with prayers and pledges. Then, after she'd finished, Tisiphone shook her hoary old locks, disheveled as usual, tossing the wriggling adders away from in front of her face. "No need for a rambling explanation," she said to the goddess. "Consider your orders done. Now quit this loathsome domain and take yourself back to your home in the healthier air of the heavens." Juno was glad to return, and just as she walked into heaven, Iris sprinkled her body with water for purification. Tisiphone wasted no time. In ruthless pursuit of her object, she seized a torch she had steeped in gore. She dressed in a red robe dyed in a stream of blood, and girdled this with a writhing snake as she left the house. She was joined on her way by the spirits of sorrow, panic, and fear, and the wild-faced demon of madness. As soon as they stood on the threshold of Aeolus's palace, the doorposts quivered, they say, and a sickly pallor spread over the maple wood panels. The sun disappeared. The omens inspired Queen Ino, Athamas too, with alarm. They at once made ready to leave, but the sinister Fury blocked their way in front of the entrance. Firmly extending her arms coiled round in the knots of her vipers, and tossed the locks on her head. The adders responded by noisily straying across her shoulders or slithering over her bosom, hissing and spewing gore and flicking their tongues in and out. Tisiphone next wrenched two of the snakes from the midst of her hair and flung them forth from her hand with lethal aim. The reptiles landed and glided over the breasts of Ino and Athamas, breathing their noxious breath on their victims without inflicting a physical wound. The deadly effect was felt in the mind. The Fury had also come with a marvelous liquid poison. Froth from Cerberus's mouth, the dreadful Echidna's venom, derangement which causes the mind to wander, blinding forgetfulness, crime and tears, with frenzy and bloodlust, all of them pounded together and blended with fresh spilt blood. This brew had been boiled in a brazen cauldron and stirred with a stalk of evergreen hemlock. Ino and Athamas quaked as she poured this poison of madness over the breasts of them both and infected their innermost being. Then, seizing a torch, Tisiphone brandished and waved it around in a circle, creating a rapid succession of flame after flame. So in triumph, her mission discharged, she returned to the shadowy kingdom of mighty Dis and untied the snake she had worn as a girdle. Immediately, Athamas, raving but still in the hall of his palace, shouted, "Huntsmen, your nets, and spread them over the woods here. Look, I've sighted a lioness, there with two of her cubs." The madman then followed his wife, as though he were stalking a wild beast. Snatching the baby Learchus away from his mother's breast, the infant was laughing and stretching his tiny hands out. Athamas swung him around in the air like a sling, then savagely shattered his own child's skull on the hard stone floor. The mother, at long last kindled to fury by grief or the power of the sprinkled poison, screamed, and with hair flowing wild, she fled from the hall in distraction, her naked arms still clutching her other child, Melicertes. "Help me, Bacchus," she cried. At the name of Bacchus, Juno laughed and replied, "Let this be the thanks that your nursling repays you." Picture a cliff hanging over the sea, its lower part hollowed out by the surf and protecting the waves beneath from the rain, and its rocky summit jutting over the open water. Ino, strong in her madness, climbed to the top of this headland and into the ocean below. Undaunted by fear, still holding the baby, she jumped. The waves turned white where she struck the surface. Venus, by contrast, was moved to pity by innocent Ino's sufferings. Gently coaxing her uncle Neptune, she begged him to help her granddaughter. "Lord of the ocean, whose power is second only to heaven's, I know I am asking the greatest of favors, But please take pity upon my children whose bodies you see are afloat in the vast Ionian Sea. Transform them to sea gods. Some credit is owed me in your domain, if I once was formed out of foam in the midst of the sea, as the story survives in my Greek name. Neptune gave his assent, and removing whatever was mortal in Ino and Ino's child, he invested them both with an awesome majesty. Changing their names, along with their human appearance, he called the new god Palaemon. The mother became Leucothoe. Ino's companions from Thebes had followed the trail of her footprints as far as they could, till they came to a halt at the edge of the headland. Certain she must be dead, they tore at their hair, ripped open their dresses, and beat their breasts in grief for the house of Cadmus. They tried to bring hatred on Juno by calling her vilely unjust and excessively cruel to her rival, Semele, Ino's sister. Angry at their reproaches, the goddess cried, "You are the people I'm going to make my excessive cruelty's principal monuments." True to her word, she acted. The friend whose devotion to Ino had been the strongest declared, "I shall follow and join my queen in the water below." She started to jump, but found herself rooted fast to the rock, unable to move. A second attempted the ritual of beating her breast and discovered her arms had suddenly stiffened. Another by chance had extended her hands to the ocean, and now a figure of stone portrayed the identical gesture. One more was clutching her hair and trying to tear it out. You could see her fingers had hardened around the hair she was tearing. Whatever pose those women were caught in, they held it forever. Some of the ill-starred daughters of Thebes were turned into gulls, which even today still brush the Ionian Sea with their wingtips. Cadmus was never aware that his daughter and baby grandson had been transformed into sea gods. His grief, a string of disasters, the numberless portents he'd witnessed had overwhelmed him. He therefore abandoned the city he once had founded, as though his undoing were due to a curse on the place, not his own bad luck. When he'd wandered far with his wife in their exile, they reached the Illyrian frontier. There, weighed down by their years and their troubles, they traced their family fortunes back to the start, and recalled the evils they'd suffered. That serpent I pierced with my spear, at the time when I came from Sidon, and scattered its teeth on the ground to grow into strange new warriors. Could it by any chance have been sacred? Cadmus wondered. Perhaps I invoked the wrath of the gods, and this is their certain revenge. If so, let me also be changed to a long-bellied serpent. As soon as he'd spoken, his form was changed to a long-bellied serpent. He felt his skin growing hard and gaining a layer of scales. His body was turning black and speckled with bluish spots. Then down he fell on his front. His two legs melded to one and little by little thinned down to a sinuous, slithery tail. He still had his arms, and while they remained, he stretched them out, as the tears streamed down the cheeks, which were still a man's. "Come close to me, please," he appealed to his wife. "Come close, poor darling, and touch me while something of mine is left. Please take my hand while it's there to be taken, before the snake has enveloped the whole of my body." Cadmus wanted to say much more, but his tongue was suddenly split into two like a fork. The words he wanted to utter failed to come out. Whenever he tried to express his sorrow, he hissed, for this was the only voice which nature had left him. Beating her naked breasts in her grief, his wife protested. "Stay with me, ill-starred Cadmus. Abandon this monstrous shape. Oh, Cadmus, what does it mean? Your feet have vanished, your shoulders, your hands, your color, your face, yes, everything while I was speaking. Heavenly gods, why cannot you make me a serpent too?" Cadmus's response was to flicker his tongue on his dear wife's cheek, glide his way to her breasts as though he knew he'd be safe there, fold himself round her and up to the neck which he'd love to caress. The friends who were present were filled with terror. Harmonia merely stroked and fondled the sleek, smooth neck of the crested serpent. Then all at once there were two of them, gliding with coils intertwined till they entered the woods nearby and quietly slipped into hiding. As in the past, they will neither avoid nor attack human beings. These snakes are harmless because they remember their former existence. Although they were now transformed into serpents, Bacchus had given his grandparents much to console them. India had been subdued to his cult, and Greece was showing him honor in fine-built temples. Acrisius, son of Abas, descended like Cadmus from Neptune, alone among all the rulers refused Dionysus admission into his city of Argos, opposed him with arms, and denied he was Jupiter's son. Moreover, he didn't accept that his grandson Perseus, conceived in the shower of gold by his daughter Danae, was Jupiter's son. But truth will out. Acrisius later regretted his violence against the god as much as his failure to know his grandson. Bacchus now was enthroned in the heavens, while Perseus was flying on whirring wings through the yielding air, bearing his famous trophy, the head of the snake-headed Gorgon. And as he triumphantly hovered over the Libyan desert, some drops of blood from the Gorgon's neck fell down to the sand, where the earth received them and gave them life as a medley of serpents, which explains why Libya now is infested with poisonous reptiles. Driven from there by the warring winds through the vast Empyrean, Perseus was wafted this way and that, like a scudding rain cloud. Poised high up in the ether, he looked right down to the earth, such a distance below, as he traversed the whole of the world in his flight. 3 times he sighted the bears in the north and the great clawed crab in the south. He would often be swept to the west, then back to the east. And now, as the day declined, mistrustful of flying at night, he touched down onto the western world in the kingdom of Atlas, and asked for a few hours' rest, till the star of the morning summoned the fires of the dawn, and signaled release for the new day's chariot. This was the home of the son of Iapetus, Atlas, whose massive frame exceeded all mortal men's. His kingdom embraced earth's farthest shore coasts and the sea, whose waters are ready to welcome the panting steeds and the weary wheels of the setting sun. 1,000 flocks and 1,000 herds were wandering over his grassy domain. No troublesome neighbors encroached on his borders. Here was a tree whose leaves were shining with brilliant gold, whose branches were also of gold and laden with golden apples. "Sir," said Perseus to Atlas at once, "if you have respect for distinction of noble birth, then I am descended from Jove. If deeds of prowess impress you, you must be impressed by mine. I therefore ask you for shelter and rest." Then Atlas remembered an ancient oracle spoken to him by Themis at Delphi. "Atlas, a time will arrive when your tree will be robbed of its gleaming gold, and a son of Jove will achieve the glory of winning it." Fearing marauders, Atlas had carefully ringed his orchard with thick-built walls and set an enormous dragon to guard it. He wanted to keep all strangers firmly away from his boundaries. Perseus was no exception. "Remove yourself," he insisted. "You're lying. The exploits you boast of and even descent from Jove may work to your disadvantage." Force was added to threats when Atlas attempted to show him out, but Perseus refused to shift and answered in tones that were mild as well as courageous. He couldn't compete in physical strength. That was out of the question. He merely said to the giant, "Well, since you value my friendship so little, here is a gift." Then turning his face, he produced from a bag on his left-hand side the loathsome head of Medusa. The mighty Atlas was turned to a mighty mountain. His hair and beard were transformed into trees, his massive shoulders and arms to a line of ridges, his erstwhile head to a cloud-capped peak. His bones became rocks. Then rising high in every direction, he grew and he grew and he grew, so the gods had decreed, till the whole of the sky with all of its stars could now bed down on his ranges. The winds had all been imprisoned by Aeolus, god of the tempests, inside his cave. The morning star, which summons to work, had risen, bright in the sky. So Perseus fastened the wings of his sandals again on his feet, and girded himself with his hooked sword. Soon he was cutting a path through the air on his fluttering anklets, passing an infinite number of countries around and below him. He finally sighted the realm of Ethiopian Cepheus, where Ammon, god of the land, had unjustly ordered the princess Andromeda, innocent girl, to pay the price for her boastful mother, who claimed to surpass the daughters of Nereus in beauty. When Perseus noticed the maiden tied by the arms to a jagged rock face, but for the light breeze stirring her hair and the warm tears coursing over her cheeks, he would have supposed she was merely a marble statue. Unconscious desire was kindled within him. Dumbly amazed and entranced by the beautiful vision before him, he almost omitted to move his wings as he hovered in the air. Then once he delighted, he said to the maiden, "Shame on such fetters! You shouldn't be bound by these, but the ties of passionate lovers. I ask you to tell me your name, sweet girl, and the name of your country. Tell me why you are chained here." At first she was silent, constrained by maidenly shyness in front of a man. If her hands had been free of their bonds, she'd have lifted them up to her face to cover her blushes. Her eyes could speak, though, filled as they were with welling tears. He continued to press her, and therefore, not to appear to be hiding a fault of her own, she told him her name and the name of her country, and how her mother had wickedly boasted about her beauty. Her story was still unfinished, when out of the sea there resounded a sinister roar, and, advancing across the expanse of ocean, breasting the surge of the waves, there emerged a menacing monster. Andromeda screamed. Her sorrowing father, and with him her mother, arrived on the scene, both greatly distressed, though the mother more justly. They brought no help, but simply engaged in the usual rituals of weeping and beating of breasts. As they clung to the girl's chained body, the stranger protested. "Your tears and laments can be safely indulged later on, and at length. A rescue is needed now, and with all speed. I am the Perseus fathered by Jove and mothered by Danae, impregnated by Jupiter's gold as she languished in prison. The Perseus who killed the snake-headed Gorgon and ventured to fly through the air on fluttering wings. If I were courting this maiden, I'd be the suitor you surely preferred for her husband to be. To these most splendid endowments, if heaven is kind, I shall add my valiant service. These are my terms. If I rescue your daughter, she shall be mine." Her parents agreed. They could hardly refuse, and to crown their entreaties they promised Perseus the kingdom as dowry. There comes the monster, parting the waves with the thrust of his huge breast, just as a war galley, strongly propelled by its sweating oarsmen, speedily furrows a path with its sharp-beaked prow through the ocean. Now it was steadily nearing the cliffs, as close as the range of a spinning bullet discharged through the air from a Balearic sling. When suddenly Perseus, pushing away from the earth with his sandals, soared aloft to the clouds. When the hero's shadow appeared on top of the water, the frightened monster fiercely attacked it. Imagine an eagle sighting a serpent, sunning its dark blue back in an empty field, and swooping down on its prey from behind. To escape the poison discharged from the fangs, it greedily grips the scaly neck in its talons. So valiant Perseus swooped straight down through the air to stab the beast in the back, and through its right shoulder he buried his sword blade up to the curved hilt. Roaring with pain and severely wounded, the monster reared itself high in the air, then plunged down into the waves, then turned, like a savage but terrified boar, when the dogs are baying around him. Poised on his swift wings, Perseus eluded his ravening enemy's jaws and went for his weak points, hacking away with his hooked sword, now at its barnacled back and then at the ribs, then again at the narrowest point of the tail, where it tapered into a fish. The monster spewed forth seawater mingled with crimson blood, drenching Perseus's sandals in spray and weighing them down. Not daring to trust his sodden wings any further, the man caught sight of a rock whose summit projects from a calm sea's surface, but cannot be seen when the ocean is rough. So Perseus the valiant, bracing himself against this, gripping its top with his left hand, plunged his weapon again and again through the monster's vitals. The shouts of applause re-echoed along the shore and above in the halls of Olympus. Andromeda's mother, Cassiopeia, and Cepheus her father, were both delighted. Perseus was hailed as their daughter's betrothed and proclaimed as the savior and stay of the house. The princess, quickly released from her chains, came forward to greet him. Her danger had prompted his feet. She was now the reward for his courage. The victorious hero cleansed his hands in the water they drew for him. Fearing to bruise the Gorgon's snake-covered head on the hard sand, he softened the ground with leaves and covered it over with seaweed, to serve as a mat for the head of Medusa, the daughter of Phorcys. The fronds, which were fresh and still abundant in spongy pith, absorbed the force of the Gorgon and hardened under her touch, acquiring a strange new stiffness in all the stems and the foliage. The sea nymphs tested this miracle out on additional fronds of seaweed. Excited to find this yielded the same result, they repeated the marvel by tossing the plant seeds over the waves. Coral, even today, preserves this identical property. Contact with air induces its hardness, and what was a flexible shoot underwater is turned to rock on the ocean surface. Next, Perseus built 3 altars of turf to 3 of the gods, the one on the left to Mercury, that on the right to Minerva, the central altar to Jupiter. Victims were duly offered: a cow for the warlike maiden, a calf for the wing-footed guide, and a bull for the king of the gods. Without any further delay, Perseus claimed the reward for his valiant deed, Andromeda, seeking no further dowry. The wedding torches were flourished by Hymen and Love. The fires were richly supplied with incense. Garlands hung from the palace roof, and everywhere singing, to music of lyre and pipe, auspiciously signified joy. And now the doors were flung open, the golden halls were revealed with a sumptuous banquet prepared, and Cepheus's court was admitted. The feasting was over, and hearts were relaxed with the flowing wine, when the bridegroom asked a few questions about the land and its products, social customs, and attitudes held by the people who lived there. The prince who replied went on, "Now, Perseus, bravest of heroes, please will you tell us the story of how your remarkable courage and skill combined to remove the head of the snake-haired Gorgon?" Their guest then mentioned a freezing glen at the foot of Mount Atlas, tightly enclosed by a fortification of massive rocks. 2 sisters had lived by the valley's entrance, the daughters of Phorcys, who shared the use of a single eye, which Perseus had craftily stolen as one was passing it on to the other, by slipping his hand underneath, thus forcing the Graiae to give him directions. He traveled through rocky regions remote and secluded, littered with broken trees, and finally came to the home of the Gorgons. Across the fields and along the tracks he had seen the statues of men and of beasts transformed to stone at the sight of Medusa. He, however, had only looked on those terrible features as they were reflected in bronze, on the shield which he held in his left hand, and while Medusa, as well as her adders, lay buried in sleep, he had lopped her head from its neck. In consequence, swift-winged Pegasus sprang from his mother's blood, along with his brother Chrysaor. Perseus also narrated the dangers he'd faced on his long voyage, naming the seas and the lands he had viewed from his flight through the air, and all the stars which he'd lightly brushed with his beating wings, but his audience wanted more. He was asked by one of the court why Medusa, alone of her sisters, had snakes entwined in her hair. "That is an excellent question," responded the guest. "Let me give you the answer. Medusa was once an exceedingly beautiful maiden, whose hand in marriage was jealously sought by an army of suitors. According to someone who told me he'd seen it, her marvelous hair was her crowning glory. The story goes that Neptune the sea god raped this glorious creature inside the shrine of Minerva. Jove's daughter screened her virginal eyes with her aegis in horror, and punished the sin by transforming the Gorgon's beautiful hair into horrible snakes. That explains why, to startle her foes into terror, the goddess always displays those snakes on the front of her bosom."